What's up, guys? Welcome to the first video of a series of videos going over some high stakes hand histories. Today we're going to be going over a LLinusLLove hand at 5100, so let's just jump in. Just to give a brief introduction to myself, my name is MoneyJ2K. I play 200L online and 2.5 live. I'm a professional poker player and I've spent hundreds of hours studying theory. Hopefully together we will be able to learn and take some principles from these different hands and apply it to our own games. So let's just jump right into the hand history and just replay the hand and just see what our first impressions are. So we face an open of about 2.25x on the button. We're in the small blind with king queen off. A pretty reasonable 3-bet. We're going to be pretty much pure 3-betting king queen off here. And we get the call from the button. We see a flop a7-3 rainbow. Again, both players are going to have some good ace-x here. We're obviously going to have some ace-king. We're going to have some ace-queen. But button will have some 7s and some 3s. But however, the main part of our range is going to be kings through 8s. That's going to be a huge part of our range advantage. And so we're going to be able to c-bet this at a really high frequency for a pretty small size. And that's exactly what Linus does. He bets about quarter pot. And we get the call from AC1DD. Go to a turn. A7-3 jack of clubs. And we put in a pretty small bet, about 1/3, 1/4 here. And it's pretty interesting. This is going to be basically a result of having a really high range advantage just on the flop as well as on the turn. And so we're going to be wanting to bet the turn at another really high frequency. But also we don't need to use very large sizes in general in 3-bet pots, simply because the SBR is so low that the river, we won't have any problem getting more money in the pot. We can always jam the river with almost any size on the turn. We face a raise on the button with king queen off here. And so we're going to have to peel this. And this is mainly because we beat all of his bluffs. And then we also have outs to the nuts. And so we can actually beat some of his value at a low frequency. However, the main part of calling this hand is that he's not raising hands like 7x and 3x very often. And he's mainly raising some flush draws. He's raising some hands that are like gut shots and stuff like that. And so we're going to be able to be beating those with the king high and the queen high, especially because we're going to be beating all the different gut shots and stuff that he ends up raising. And so we're going to need to call this here, even though it doesn't feel great. However, it does feel pretty good when you river the straight. And so he bets all in here for about pot. And this is obviously just going to be a slam dunk call. Not really anything else we can do here, especially with the king of clubs. We call, he shows the ace jack, and whole hand is played very well for both players. Ace jack is obviously a raise on the turn. He's got top 2 pair, and he really just got rivered. Linus ran very good in this hand. So now I'm going to jump over to GTO Wizard, and we're just going to put in the spot in the software, and we're going to be able to pull it up fairly quickly. So it's A7-3 rainbow. So A7-3 with a 3 of hearts. Put it in. And so now we see the solution for the small blind c-betting range here. And so just about as we expected, we have about 20% and 54% are pretty much the only sizes used. We're only checking 23.7%. So from the overall perspective, we're basically betting about 73% of the time, 76% of the time, and for a pretty small size, about 20%. And the reason for this, if we go over here and we can see just how many sets and 2 pairs and top pairs and whatnot that we basically have a slight disadvantage between the sets and 2 pairs. So if we look at the sets here, he has, villain has 4.2%. So the button has 4.2% of sets, and we only have 3.3%. So he has a slight advantage in the sets, and then we only have 1.1% of 2 pair. And the button has 1.7%. So he has a slight advantage on sets and 2 pairs. However, in 3-bet pots, it isn't quite that important, because if he has a set and we have a hand like, ace king, he's just getting all the money. And that's primarily a factor of just the stack to pot ratio being so small and being just where we can't face a ton of aggression from the button. Whereas in a single raise pot, the button could go overbet, 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 and a lot of our top pair hands are going to end up having to fold because they're facing 2x pot overbets. However, in 3-bet pots, the button really can't do that. The button can only go half pot, half pot, half pot, or maybe one overbet jam. But we're going to be able to face much less aggression simply just because our stack to pot ratio is much smaller. So the slight disadvantage we have in sets and 2-pair isn't going to be that definitive of what our overall strategy is. In this specific spot, our overall strategy is going to be much more defined by the marginal hands. And this is also pretty common in general when we're flop c-betting. Our marginal hands are hands like top pair, some low kicker hands, like ace 6, ace 4, ace 5s, some ace 10 off, ace jack off. And then some under pairs where we add in like kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 9s, and 8s. Where a lot of these can bet really small and get value from hands like backdoor flush draws, hands like gut shots, hands like 7x, 3x, and whatnot. And so these are really the primary reason why this 20% size is used at such a high frequency. And so just to apply this to our game, in general, when we're the 3-better and the board is disconnected with a high card, so disconnected with like a king or a queen or an ace or sometimes a jack, we can generally just bet almost our entire range for a really small size, just because when we're the 3-better, our pre-flop range is just uncapped. And so we really get to get away with all kinds of very small bets at really high frequencies. And if we just put in the 20% bet size, we see that we actually have almost no fold equity. And a lot of players don't want to use these really small sizes, these 20% sizes, these 33% sizes, because they say, oh, my bluffs will never get folds. And the response to this is basically, we don't want folds. When you're at an entire range advantage, when every single part of your range, except here, of course, is the top 2% of the range, we don't have an advantage there. But the rest, the top 98% or the bottom 98% of our range, we are basically pretty far ahead of the button's range here. So we actually want calls. Because we're so far ahead with our range, we are not afraid of calls, because he's primarily going to be calling with hands that are worse than our hands. If we just look at some of the calls he has to come up with here, I mean, he has to call with 9-8 with the backdoor, and that's not even the craziest. I mean, he has to call with 10-8, he has to call with jack-8, he has to call with hands like pocket twos. He has to call, basically every pair has to call. There's quite a lot of hands here that maybe players either aren't finding, and then the bet is just completely printing. But even if they are finding, there's going to be a lot of tough plays that they're going to have to play on the turn with a lot of these different hands. And they're also going to have to raise a lot. So if we look at, he needs to raise about 14% of the time. And again, it's going to be a lot of different hands that don't always make a lot of sense. And so basically, when we use this really small bet here, this 20% pot size bet, we just end up putting our opponent in some spots where he has to play some pretty large pots with some pretty marginal hands. So this really small size is something that's really, 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 really high value, and something that we can put into our game very quickly. And it's pretty easy to do, right? Like for us, all we have to do is bet 20%, and we put the button in all kinds of interesting spots. He has to start calling, and he has to start raising with hands that he may not really want to raise. And so it's a really good strategy, both theoretically and exploitatively. But anyways, we put in the 20% pot bet, and the button ends up calling. We're going to jump over to the turn. Jack of club turn. And so here we're actually betting an even higher frequency than we were on the flop. And again, it's just a factor that we have a huge range advantage still. We have a ton of different high quality hands here that we simply just can bet for almost whatever size we want. However, in this specific spot, we start betting this 20% size fairly often, and then this 56% size. And so again, I think a lot of players will make the mistake of using some larger sizes here. They'll start using some 25 big blinds into 32 big blinds, some 80% of pots, some 90% of pots. Some players will even just jam because they're afraid of the flush draw. And that is a pretty big mistake. And so the reason it's a mistake is that we are almost always in a 3-bet pot. We're almost always trying to get our good high value hands in over 3 streets. And so basically we are always trying to bet the flop a size where we can bet the turn a size where we can jam the river for about half pot to a pot. So we were basically, to put it in a sentence, we are trying to set up the river SPR to be between about 0.5 and 1 SPR. And we can't always do that. Sometimes it's not reasonable, but in this specific spot, that's the main reason that we're using this 56% pot size here and not using some larger sizes. We're really trying to force our opponent to put in to put a lot of money in with a pretty wide range. If we look here, he's only folding 40% against this half pot size, and so he's still having to call with every flush draw. He's having to call with 9-7, even raising it sometimes. He's having to call with 8-7. He's having to call with gut shots like 6-5 and 5-4. He's having to call with just some second pairs like King Jack. Even some players aren't calling King Jack here, and that's a pretty big mistake. He's having to call with 9s and 10s, and this is against the half pot size. So the half pot size is used primarily because when we hit call and we just put in some random river, our SPR is, we're betting, we have about 66.5 behind, and the pot is 68. So we can jam for roughly pot. So we don't really need to jam the turn because we can very naturally and easily jam the river. And in situations where, if he rivers the flush, he just usually is just going to get the money because the ranges are so wide that his whole range isn't just flushes. But to go back to the actual line and go back to the turn, and we actually can put in the other line. So that's the reason why we use this 56% size. I think this is a pretty standard spot. I think a lot of mid-stakes players, 100L and up, will be able to find this 56% size. However, I don't think many players are finding this 20% size either. And the 20% size is a factor of that very large range advantage. And the 20% size is a little bit of trying to it's basically just trying to get a lot more thin value. And so if we filter by this 20% size and we go through some of the different hands that are betting, we're betting hands like Jack 10. We're betting hands like Jack 9. We're betting these second pair into this 20% size. We're putting we're putting a lot of hands that can go for some thin value, like pocket 10s, pocket 9s, pocket 8s, pocket 7s. And a lot of these are just or I guess pocket 7s is a set. But these hands are all just going to be able to get called by a lot worse hands. Like if we just think about having like a hand like Jack 10 here, we're getting called by every King 10. We're getting called by every gut shot. We're getting called by every King Queen, every King Queen off, every King Jack off. We're getting called by Jack 8 suited, Jack 9 suited. We're getting called by every single 7X. We're getting called by gut shots. We're getting called by just all kinds of different hands that we're beating. We're also getting called by a lot of flushes. So if we just filter by the club hands, we're getting called by a lot of flush draws, like hands that just don't get to fold for 20% size. And we get to get value from these flushes. We're not really that afraid of the flush. We're trying to get value from these flush draws. And I think it's a common misconception that we need to be very afraid of the flush draw. We really don't. We want to get value from the flush draw. We want the flush draws to call most of the time. And so if we moving forward, we bet that 20% size and we end up actually getting raised in the hand, which he needs to do quite often. Actually, if we look at the raise size and the raise range, he's raising. Let's filter by the raise range. He's raising these King 8 suited hands. He's raising top pair and 2 pairs. If we look at, he's raising Ace 9, Ace 8, Ace 3, another 2 pair hand, Ace 10, Ace Jack. He has value here. He has 7s. He has 3s. He has a good amount of value here. So he can find these raises. He has Ace Jack. So he definitely wants to have a raise range, because if we have Ace Jack or we have Ace 7 or we have 7s, we want to put money in the middle. We want to bloat up the pot so that we can jam the river again. And then we just look at some of the bluffs he has. He's bluffing, he's bluffing these club hands. He's bluffing King 6 and King 8 and King 9 and King Queen king queen of clubs here. He's bluffing these different gut shots, and he's even bluffing some third pair, but very, very low frequency. And that's actually important for our hand. If we just simply look at how often he's bluffing a pair, it's very, 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 very low frequency that he bluffs a pair. Most of the time, it's these hands like 10-8 and 9-8 and these gut shots and whatnot. And he's very rarely raising with a hand like 7-6 and 8-7. And so if we look at our range as the small blind versus it, we end up calling king queen off at a frequency that is notable. Where yes, we're raising it a good amount and we're calling it a good amount and we're folding, so it's mixed. And this just means that this is what's theoretically called a bluff catcher. And a bluff catcher basically just means that you're beating all the bluffs, but you don't beat any value. And so you're going to call the perfect frequency that will balance your overall range so that your opponent can't just raise every single hand and get you to fold way too much. So this is basically, a bluff catcher is just a hand that's used to balance your range and in order to make sure that your opponent can't bluff too often. And this is probably where Linus makes a very small mistake. He really should only be jamming or folding the king of club hands. And this goes back to the raise range that the button has. If we pull up the raise range and we just put in, and we put in these club hands again, he has a lot of his raises are like king 6, king 8, king 9, king queen. And so having the king of clubs blocks all of these different raises. And so it actually blocks a lot of the bluffs. And that when you block a lot of the bluffs, it obviously just means that your opponent has a lot of a higher frequency of value in their range because you block their bluff. The king of club doesn't really block a whole lot of value bets on the turn that raise. And so when we go back to the raise range and we call, we do end up getting to call king queen off a little bit. Just because of that, and going through so we can see that the non-club king queens actually do call a sizable percentage, and then they fold a little bit, and then the king of clubs jam over the top. I don't think this is a very big mistake from Linus. Obviously, he also could be exploiting his specific player, and I don't think it's a big deal to make this mistake at all. Going through some of just the other hands that we have that end up calling, our bluff catchers are hands like 9s, 10s, 8s, and I would not recommend most players to be calling these hands simply because your opponent is not bluffing enough. Most opponents do not find this raise on the turn, and so we really do end up getting to fold out a lot of these bluff catchers. However, when you're playing, stakes like 50-100, your opponent might be finding these bluffs, and they may even be over bluffing these spots. And so we do have to actually call these kind of hands at the highest stakes. However, if you're playing micros, if you're playing 100NL, if you're playing 200NL, these guys just aren't bluffing these spots nearly as high of a frequency as they need to be. And so we can turn a lot of these bluff catchers into pure folds. Moving forward, I think it's a pretty good simplification to just fold a lot of your bluff catchers when you face high aggression. I think most stakes, these lines are under bluffed, and we can pretty comfortably just fold the hands like king queen. However, again, Linus is playing 50-100. He has to make some of these calls that may not always feel great. So Linus puts in the call. And the river was the 10 of clubs, another pretty interesting river, and obviously one of the better rivers for our exact hand. Now we beat a ton of value. We obviously check our entire range, and maybe that isn't obvious. So the reason we can't really donk on this river very much, and I think a lot of players would also make that mistake of donking this river a little bit too often when they hit their flush, in that we really don't have many flushes here. And that's might seem a little unintuitive, but when we bet this 20% size, very few of our flushes are going into it. These aren't really these aren't really being put into our 20% size, and when we do get raised, they really aren't calling very much. And we go back and put in the clubs. Very few of these are calling, and then when we have this king of club hands, it's just not going to be a very high frequency play for us to have many flushes. So we hit call, confirm. And so this isn't exactly 0%. This is actually, if we turn on the weight, these hands are almost never in our range if we turn on range height. So it's just a rounding error. And we hit check. So obviously we're checking our range because we have very few flushes. And if we go over to him, he has 6.6% of flushes. He has even straight flushes. So he has a pretty large range advantage on this board. And it makes sense. He raised the turn, so he has a lot more high value hands. And so he's jamming what is going to be a pretty nutted range. He's going to be jamming king queen here. He's going to be jamming top two pair here. He's going to be jamming all the nut flushes, obviously. He's going to be jamming some of these 8-7 hands even to balance his range, some 9-8 hands that just hit that straight on the river. He's gonna have some sets. He's gonna have quite a lot of different hands here. And if we turn on range height, we can see that a lot of his highest frequency hands are like ace jack, and king queen, some sevens. He's gonna have a lot of sets here. And so when we face the jam with king queen, it's pretty much just a slam dunk call. And as just the solve pretty much says, king queen is beating just a ton of value here, even though we may not have we may not have the flush. We still are just having to snap call with king queen off here. It's going to be just winning a ton. And we're even calling like ace queen. We're even calling ace king. We're having to call pretty wide here again, because if villain hit a set, if villain hit a flush, he just gets the money. We beat tons of bluffs. He's jamming fairly wide. If we go back to his jam range, he is jamming a lot of these different bluffs. He's jamming 8-7. He's jamming hands like 6-5 and 5-4, and even like pocket twos and pocket fours and pocket fives and pocket sixes. He's bluffing a pretty high frequency here, and so we really can't get away with folding these top pair hands, especially when we're only facing a pot bet. So we don't need to be right very often. And so these top end top pair top kicker hands, while they may be very low EV, if we switch over to the EV line here, they only have 0.77 EV, 0.46, 0.28. They're very low EV, but they do still have to call. And so it's important to know that. And if we look at the EV of the king queen hands, they have huge amounts of EV here, and so folding these would be very bad. And so the river kind of ends up playing itself. If we go back to strategy, the river, we call a lot of really good hands. If we go over to filters, we're calling 100% of sets, 100% of straights, 100% of flushes, 100% of the straight flushes, and then we're going to be mixing with a two pair. We're going to be mixing with a top pair. So basically, we're calling our best two pair here, not calling ace 10 and jack 10, and instead we're also mixing with the top pairs, where we're only calling the top end top pairs as well. And I think this river is fairly intuitive. I think a lot of players will be able to find these calls, and I don't think many players are going to be folding king queen here. So I don't think many players are even folding sets here. And so I think this is pretty well played by both players. I think obviously ace jack is good enough to get it in when we're calling with hands like ace king and ace queen and whatnot. And so I think it's a very well played hand, and that makes a lot of sense given that it's 5,100. So that's going to be the end of the hand history part of this video. There's going to be a series of these kinds of videos. So if you would like to have a specific high stakes hand reviewed, or possibly even your own hand reviewed, leave a link to that hand in the comments or join our Discord. The link should be in the description. Either way, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. And if you would like to get notified for any more videos that we make in this series, please subscribe. Thank you.